On July 10th, we unveil the all-new JG9 Studios, the coolest NFL office on YouTube where all future streams will take place. Video drops at 6 p.m. Eastern, and a celebratory live stream drops at 9 p.m. Eastern. And now, on with our feature presentation. Why do people watch the pregame show before the game starts? Well, there are plenty of reasons for that, especially back in the 1980s. For some, it's just on as background noise until the game starts, or you flip it on because there's nothing else on. However, for a lot of people, they enjoy the pregame show because it is the one chance that they get to hear about NFL news and NFL inside information that they might not hear anywhere else. Obviously, that reason doesn't really apply now with the rise of 24/7 sports television and sports talk radio and everything else under the sun. But back in the 1980s, when there really was no other outlet for that outside of ESPN, which was still in its infancy and didn't have the rights to any NFL games, this was a big deal. You watched the pregame show to hear news and the latest developments around the NFL, and to catch up on things that you might have missed in your local newspaper. The pregame show can be a goldmine of information, and a lot of crazy stories have been broken through one of those pregame shows, even today. Which makes it very, very awkward, embarrassing, and unprofessional when the pregame show reports on something as a fact, says that it's going to happen, and then it's blatantly wrong, to the point where the team that's the subject of the report has to put out a statement immediately afterwards saying that they had no idea where they got their information, because it's not true in the slightest bit. Well, in 1985, that's exactly what happened with this pregame show right here that you've been watching this whole time. NFL 85. As in, the pregame show for NBC that changed its name every year to correspond with the year that it was. During one of their shows in 1985, in front of the whole country, they reported on something involving the Indianapolis Colts as a stone-cold fact, and reported this supposed inside information. And it got refuted and debunked just as quickly as they reported it. Because this is the story behind one of the biggest NBC controversies of the 1985 season, and the drama between the Peacock and the Colts. Before I talk about the actual controversy in question, we need some context to understand how the Colts were doing heading into this point, because it will help us understand why this report even existed in the first place. I don't think anyone had any real expectations for the Colts heading into the 1985 season, and understandably so, seeing as, according to the Vegas odds makers, they had the worst odds in the entire NFL to win the Super Bowl at plus 10,000. For some perspective on how high those odds are, it means that if you were to bet $100 on the Colts winning the Super Bowl, you would have lost $100. It was a team that had the worst offense in the NFL the previous year, and did next to nothing in the offseason to improve it, as they still have the same quarterback mess. It was a team that switched coaches after Frank Kush left for the USFL and was replaced by Rod Dowhower, and was a team that had arguably the worst owner in football in Robert Irsay, whose team had not had a winning record since 1977 and had not won a playoff game since 1971. So yeah, no one had high hopes for the Colts entering the 1985 season. But to start the season off, my God, watching the Colts was like you were watching a completely different sport. It was like every other team was playing chess, and the Colts were eating the pieces. That's how bad they were. Through the first two games of the season, not only were they 0-2, but they were playing games that weren't even remotely close, losing 45-3 to the Pittsburgh Steelers and 30-13 to the Miami Dolphins. Granted, I don't think anyone expected the Colts to win those games, seeing as they were both on the road and were against the two teams that made it to the AFC Championship in 1984. But the minus 59 point differential, or roughly 30 points per game, and the 75 points allowed, both of which were the worst totals in the league through the first 2 weeks, don't lie. The Colts were a bad football team, especially offensively averaging 8 points per game, and they were not going to be pleasantly surprising people this year, barring a complete miracle. And the theme to both of those games for the Colts? An absolutely atrocious offense that was about as successful at moving the ball as armies are invading Russia in the winter. And the main reason for that was the atrocious play by their quarterbacks. In Week 1, which was the 45-3 loss to the Pittsburgh Steelers, former first-round pick and one of the biggest busts in the history of the NFL, Arch Leister got the nod. He went 12 for 25, completing less than 50% of his passes for 107 yards, no touchdowns, 2 interceptions, and a passer rating of 26.6, which is worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball into the ground on every single play. Backup quarterback Mike Pagel came in and did no better, going 1 for 4. As a team, the Colts completed just 43% of their passes that day, and had 112 net passing yards to go along with 9 first downs. The following week against the Dolphins, Mike Pagel started, but only completed 50% of his passes with a touchdown and an interception. Combined as a team through 2 games, the Colts were 29 for 62 in passes completed, so just over 46%, and a passer rating of 48.5. Any way you want to slice it, that is abysmal. If the Colts were going to have any chance whatsoever at salvaging their season, they were going to need to improve their quarterback situation drastically, because it was abundantly clear, based on how this season had gone thus far, as well as how 1984 went with the same quarterbacks, that the winning quarterback was not on their roster. Fortunately for the Colts, they had help on the horizon, because they had this guy right here about to enter the fold, according to Larry King on NBC's pregame show, NFL 85, when he went on the air before the team's Week 3 battle and home opener against the Detroit Lions. This quarterback is Ed Luther, and oddly enough, this is not the first time that I've done a video about Luther, as I talked about his time with the San Diego Chargers, and in particular, a bizarre comment that he made during the 1983 season following a victory against the New York Giants. If you want to learn more about that, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, Luther was no stranger to professional football by this point in 1985. He was drafted by the San Diego Chargers out of San Jose State in the 4th round of the 1980 NFL Draft, and was the backup quarterback behind the legendary and future Hall of Fame man Dan Fouts for 5 years. Now, when Luther got his chance to shine in the NFL, the results were, shall we say, mixed at best. In his 9 starts with the Chargers throughout the 1983 and 1984 season, he went just 2-7, and was absolutely abysmal in 1983, throwing 7 touchdowns and 17 interceptions, which is a touchdown-to-interception ratio hovering around 1 to 2.5. He had a passer rating that season of just 56.6, which among all qualified quarterbacks in the league, of which there were 28 of them, ranked 26th, or 3rd from the bottom. He also had the 2nd worst interception percentage in the league, as only Green Bay Packers quarterback Lynn Dickey threw an interception on a higher percentage of his passes. However, as bad as those stats were, there was a bright spot for Luther. For one, in his last season in the NFL in 1984, he started the final 3 games of the season for the Chargers, and in those 3 games, played very well, throwing 3 touchdowns and no interceptions while posting a passer rating of 82.8, which was well above the league-wide average of 76. And number 2, as you can tell based on the clips that you've been watching, he had a lot of experience throughout the 1985 season in the United States Football League, as he was the starting quarterback on the Jacksonville Bulls after their starter, former MVP of the NFL and former Cleveland Browns quarterback Brian Sight, got injured. And all things considered, Luther was pretty good under center for the Bulls, even though they could not make the playoffs that year. Among the 16 qualified quarterbacks in the league, which included future NFL stars and notable names like Jim Kelly, Bobby Hebert, and Doug Williams, Luther was in the top half of the league in passer rating. His completion percentage of 60% was the 4th highest in the league, And even though he wasn't necessarily asked to do a ton, since the Bulls' offense primarily ran through the great running of future Pro Bowl running back Mike Rozier, Ed Luther was a solid quarterback who proved that he belonged in professional football. So you had a guy who was one of the better quarterbacks in the USFL at a time when the USFL was set to move to the fall, and no one really knew what the future of the league held. You had a guy who, the last time he was in the NFL, actually played all right in the final 3 games of the year and proved that he belonged. And you had a guy who, let's be honest, could not be any worse at this point than Mike Pagel or Arch Leister, seeing as watching the Colts try and throw the ball over their first 2 games of the season was a war crime. Which is why it made complete sense as to why the Colts would not only try to acquire a quarterback to help bolster their offense, but why it would be this quarterback in particular, Ed Luther. And on September 22nd, 1985, just minutes before the Colts were set to take on the Lions, Larry King reported on NBC's pregame show that the Colts were going to sign Ed Luther to their roster. It was reported on as a fact, and as essentially a done deal. Millions of people around the country now heard the news and knew that after this week, the Colts were going to have a new starting quarterback, as Ed Luther was going to Indianapolis. The only problem? None of that was true. Not a single word of that was true. Larry King and NBC made up that report out of thin air and lied to everyone about the fact that the Colts were going to acquire Ed Luther. Because quite simply, that was not happening. After the Colts won their first game of the season, defeating the Lions 14-6 in a game where Mike Pagel threw no touchdowns and 2 interceptions and completed just 43% of their passes, so they won it in spite of him and not because of him, all of the talk wasn't even about the Colts finally getting a win, and head coach Rod Dowhower getting the first win of his head coaching career. Rather, all of the talk was about the team being set to acquire this man right here, Ed Luther, according to the NBC report that came out right as the Colts were set to kick off and take the field at the Hoosier Dome. The great irony in all of this is that that game was televised by CBS. And the Colts were completely perplexed as to where the heck that report came from, because none of that was true. Said owner Robert Irsay quite bluntly, "The story is utterly ridiculous. We are not pursuing Ed Luther, and I don't know where the story came from. There was no truth to what was said." And if that wasn't clear enough, head coach Rod Dowhower echoed those thoughts and said, "There is no credence to the reports. We have not talked to Ed Luther or his agent." And if that, somehow, wasn't clear enough that the report from NBC was complete and utter nonsense, and that no part of it was even remotely true, Dowhower continued and said, "It's not true. He's still with the USFL, so even if we wanted, we couldn't. We had to go through enough legalities just to sign Leonard Coleman." For some context on that last part, in 1984, the Colts spent their first-round pick, which was number 8 overall, on Vanderbilt defensive back Leonard Coleman. However, he spurned the Colts initially to play for the Memphis Showboats in the USFL. The Colts, after a lengthy and extensive battle, finally were able to sign him and acquire him from Memphis in 1985. And there was no way whatsoever that the Colts wanted to do that again and fight the USFL and pony up a lot of money, even if they wanted to sign Ed Luther. So just to recap, the Colts never talked with Ed Luther or his agent, and didn't want to get into a battle with the USFL like they just did with Leonard Coleman. And yet, for some reason, NBC reported on this as a fact, and reported that the Colts had their brand new quarterback coming. Good job with that one, NBC. You really did your due diligence there. Oddly enough, in 1986, the Colts did sign Ed Luther in the middle of the season as a backup quarterback following an injury to Jack Trudeau, and also because the USFL was done by that point. So every player in the Spring League was now available to be signed to the NFL with no legal battle with the teams whatsoever. Luther never took a snap for the Colts, but he was on the roster as an emergency option following that. So NBC turned out to be right 1 year late and on a completely different set of circumstances. However, you have to feel bad for head coach Rod Dowhower here. He finally got his first win as a head coach, and here he was, unable to even celebrate afterwards because he and the rest of the team, including owner Robert Irsay, had to fend off ridiculous and completely untrue reports that the team was signing Ed Luther. When something gets reported on the pregame show live on TV, it's being shown to the entire country and being shown to millions upon millions of football fans. It's why you have to double-check your sources and make sure you get everything right. Because when you make up a report like this, it not only damages your credibility, but it hurts the organization that's impacted, because it's one more distraction and one more mess that they have to deal with. Because in 1985, when it came to Ed Luther, in the words of Josh Peck, NBC and Larry King were definitely not truthers. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.